Hello everyone and welcome to this tutorial. Today we will be building a water reminder app tutorial. What this app will do, it will be a simple project, simple backend service for water reminder and hydration tracker in Node.js. The application will be designed to help users to stay healthy by managing custom reminders, tracking daily intakes, managing states, and you will learn also how to work with SQLite with Node.js using the better SQLite 3 package. Also the relational database design by understanding how to structure tables with proper data types like integer, real text, primary keys, auto incremental IDs, etc. You will also work with proper statements as we will be defining them in this file, the db.js, and you will see like when we implement this, we will be having a good layer of security to prevent and protect our application against any SQL injections attack. Also, there will be some advanced SQL techniques, like we will be implementing the flexible update queries using the coalesce to selectively modify records without overwriting existing data. And we will be using Node.js, Express, and SQLite as our three primary packages to build this application. So let's get started. Okay everyone, so let's begin with our db.js file. This file will contain everything regarding the database initialization, creation. Also we will be used to execute and run to create our tables, and also to state and define our statements, which will be used initially when we define the routes in our index.js file to perform all the operation on the database. So first of all, we require to use the better SQLite 3 package, which is a fast and high performance SQLite library for Node.js. It makes the database operations super clean and fast. So we will start by defining the database, and it requires the better SQLite 3. Then we will create a new instance of our database using the keyword new database, and then we will define the name of the file. So this will be, in another word, the name of our database, and we will call this water reminders.db. So basically, when we run this project, it will look for this file in our disk, meaning in our root folder for the project. If it's not exist, it will create it. If it's already exist, it will not duplicate it. Then we will call the db.execute command, and this will be used to create and define our tables. Now you can notice that I am using GitHub Copilot, so it's give me this autocomplete lines, which actually we will be using them to make the process faster. So we will be create a table if not exist, but we will not call this users, we will call this reminders. Now what do we have in this table? We will have our ID, which will be our primary key for this project. It will be an integer primary key, auto incremental, so it will be auto increment by each value, and it will always be unique. Then we have the time, which is a text not null. Then we will have our third value, which will be the interval minutes. And basically what are these values is the time will be used to the starting time of the reminder. For example, this will be at 9, for example. Now for the interval minutes, it will be the time where we frequently do the reminder. Like for example, we can say 1 hour, which is 60 minutes. So each 60 minutes we will be calling the reminder for the user. Then we want to notify the user with a message, so we will have a message. Also it will be a text not null. And finally we will have this active value, which will be basically act as a flag to determine if the reminder is active or not. So we will give it a default value, and assuming that by default it is active, so we will give it active 1 by that. And now we do have the full table for the reminder. Now don't forget to have a semicolon to close this table, and then we will start another table. I'm gonna copy that because we might need to use some values in both tables. This will call the intake logs, and this table will track the individual water consumption event over time. And of course it will also have an ID, which will be the primary key for this table, but we will not be needing many of the other fields, so I'm just gonna delete them. Actually, for the time we will have a timestamp. This will also be a text not null. We will have the date, which will also be a text not null. And we will have maybe the most important one, which is the volume of the water consumed, and this will be an amount, and this will be a real, not integer, not null, sorry. And by that we have now created our two tables, the reminders and the intake log. Now, instead of writing a raw SQL strings everywhere in our routes, we are going to organize our database queries using the prepare statements inside a reminder object. So first of all, we will create our reminder object, and within this object we will define our queries, and we will start by the fetch all reminders, which is a get all, like that. And now we call the db instant dot prepare, and here we want to select, I need to have between two quotations, so select all from our table, which will be the reminders, but we also want to add ordered by time, and this will always get the latest for us. In another word, it is an ascending order for the get all, which is more logical. Now we want to create the second statement, which will be comma. Now we want to create the second one, which will be get by id, and this will be similar to the previous one, but since we are grabbing some value by its id, we need to use this keyword, which is where, and this question mark right here represent the value that will be passed when we are calling this method in our rows. Now the third value here will be the insert function, which will be used in our post request. So insert db.prepare, and this will be as the following. So we want to insert into the reminders table, and what we want to insert is basically will be the time, the interval minutes, the message, like so. And also we need to add the active as well. It might also be changed or need to be added by the post request. And again, when we pass this question mark in the statement of the SQL, it means that this data will be basically passed by the body request params or by the function itself. Now we will do the delete before we do the update, because in the update we will be using something a little bit advanced, but it will be very helpful in the future. So the delete will be delete from, and also since we want to delete only one record, not all of them, we will pass where id equal to the question mark, which will be the id itself. Now for the update, what this will do is that we are going to use a new keywords called the chorus. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. What this does is basically take our parameter, and if this past parameter is undefined or null, then as a fallback it will keep the existing column. So basically in the update, which is the put request, we are going to update some value in our record. But if this value has any issue, it was null, it was undefined with different maybe type, then instead of corrupting the record itself, it will perform a fallback mechanism to keep that record, the old record, which was correct without any issue. Now how this is going to work, we will call this update. Now again, db.prepare. Okay, and here is what we are going to do. So first of all, we need to call the keyword, which is update. So we will start with the update, and we call the reminders, which is our table name. Now what we want to do here is we want to set time, and we will call now this function, which again it's called the coalesce. So COALESCE, and we will call it like so. We will pass the value, which will be the new value, because as we mentioned, this coalesce keyword takes two parameters or more, but in our case it will take two. So it will take the new value and it will take the already existing time, and the same thing actually is going to happen to the next field. So I'm gonna just hit tab, because again, when we call this coalesce function, we are passing a new value and we want to update the already existing value. So if this value was null or undefined, as a fallback, it will not update it and it will keep our data safe. Now of course, since we are using an update for a specific value in our table, so we need of course to pass also the id, similar to the deletion and similar to the get by id. Okay, so this is for our reminders object. Now we want to have another object which will be the intake object. You can call it intake or intake logs. I will just call it the intake, and this actually will have the same thing. So we will have the insert values, and we will have the get all, the get by date function, and we will have the delete. And as you can see, it's all same thing as happened in here. We are calling the name, the keyword for the operation, the SQL, either select or a delete. We don't have an update actually in our intakes, because this is as we mentioned, it's for the water consumption, either by amount, timestamped, or date. So we don't really need to update anything, but it's worth to observe that in here, when we want to get all, we want to retrieve the complete history of the water intakes by newest first. So that's why we are passing the descending order right here. And in here we are order by the timestamp descending order, which is of course similar to what we mentioned. And that's it. This is for the intake object. And now the final thing to do is we call the module export, and we export everything, not only the object of reminders and intakes, but also the DB, which also will be used in our index folder. Now with this, I think we have everything regarding the db.js, but honestly, there is something I think we can get by date. This is select from. Okay, so intakes logs where date. Yeah, also this seems to be correct. Yeah, but I don't think that we need this descending keyword, because we're only going to order by timestamp. But yeah, this is correct. I think this makes maybe more sense. But if you want to add the order ascending, descending, it will not be different, since you already since you can do any filters on the function itself and call it with the order that you want. And since we do have the date, it will make more sense to fetch maybe the newest before the oldest, and so on. Okay, so for now I think we are done. We have completed everything regarding the db.js file. Again, just to recap, we require the better SQLite 3 package. We create a new instance of our database, and once we run the app, you will see a new file created here in the root of the project on the disk, which will call the water reminder.db. And if we run it again, it will not be duplicated, because this instance, if the table is already existed, if the database already existed, will not recreate it. We already also created the tables. We have now two tables, the reminders and the intake logs, and we also have two objects for the reminder and the intake, and each one contain all the statements that will be used. And again, the defining the statement here is not mandatory. You can write a raw SQL in the roots itself when we move to the index, but again, as we mentioned earlier, this could be very helpful and could act as a simple, but yet I believe it's an efficient layer to protect you from SQL injection attack. Okay, so now we will be moving to our index.js file to complete the project. Alright guys, so now we will proceed with the project by setting up our main entry file to the project, which is the index.js file. We will start by importing Express. Express, of course, is a framework in Node.js, which is used to and help us to make it easier for us to build frameworks and APIs with Node.js. Then we will define the port. We will keep it simple. We will use 3000 as a static, since we don't have a local .env file. Also, I want to import the DB alone in the index, since the reminders and the intake will be used when we create and set up the routers and the controllers. And now let's create our middleware, which is app use express.json. Of course, we will not do any operation, so we will go straight to the listen, and I will just auto-complete this. And the reason that I imported the DB in the index, because we need to handle something called a graceful shutdown handling for the database. And what this does basically is that when we are working with a database file on the disk, especially like SQLite, we want to make sure that we don't leave any connection logs hanging if our app crashes or restart. So the following code, which is basically this, we will create this method, which is the close DB, and this will basically close our database. And then we will define three processes, which are the process on, and I will explain that in just a minute. And also we need to define the exit one as well. So basically what this does is that we are handling the close in 3 scenarios, which are of course exiting the app. Also this indicates a signal interrupter, which is the most common one. Maybe if you tap like Control C from the project, it will stop immediately. So again, we don't need to leave anything hanging before or while closing the app in terms of the database. The third one indicates like a signal terminate, and this is something maybe general, and it is maybe general to the operation system itself. But having these 3 lines of code will help us to handle safely the close of or the crash of the app in a way that does not affect the app itself. Okay, so now we have our index ready. Of course, we didn't do anything yet, to be honest, because right now we didn't create anything related to the reminder and the index. And as I mentioned earlier, we are not going to write everything here in the index.js file. Instead, we will define our controllers and our routers. So we will start by creating the first folder, which will be the controllers. And also we will define the routes. I will now create a new folder, which will be the helpers, and this will actually have only one file, which we will be calling the date helper.js. The reason for that is because since we are working with time in this project, we need to have a function that can return the date with the correct format. So what I'm going to do is define this function. We will call it the, for example, the date today, and this will be a function that will have the instant of date this will return the instant of date, and it will return it to the format of isostring by splitting the t. And then we will simply export this function, so we will be able to use it in other files and without the need to redefine it or recall it again. So we will start with our first controller, which will be the reminder controller. And this will handle all the operation that we will be perform on the reminder table. First of all, we will start by importing the reminder. And this will be imported from the DB file. Then we will start with our first and basic operation, which is called all reminders. So this will be get all reminders, and it will have a request response, and this will simply return a row, and this row will call the reminder dot get all function. Dot all function. So, and we will return the response as a JSON. Now, to explain this get all method is the same method that we already defined in our DB file in the reminder statement. The statement of get all from this object is basically running this query, which is returning all the reminders from the database. And this is what we are going to do basically, is we are going to call each one of these statements to the reminder object and perform a query on the table to either get, delete, insert, or even update the existing data. So after we finish the get all, now we can call the get reminder by ID function. And this one is very similar, with maybe the biggest difference here is, if you remember, in this statement, we are using the where ID. So basically, we need an ID from the user, which will be passed by the params request. Now, how can we handle that? We will simply define an ID, and this ID will be the request .params.id. And even better, to handle this, to ensure that the passed value is an integer, we can use the built-in function, which is casting the input into an integer by calling the parse integer to that requested param ID. And if we do that, we are now handling that our ID that will be passed from the request is an integer, so we can perform the where keyword on it and get that specific row and return it to the user with the response. Now we will define another row. We will also call the reminder, but this time we will call the get by ID function, and this will not get all as this. It will use only get, and we will pass the ID that we already defined. Now, since we are doing a validation over the ID, we must ensure that this ID exists. And to do so, we can have a simple if statement checking if this row is exist or not. If it's not existed in our table, we can return 404 like that stats code with an error message like the reminder was not found. And if it exists, we will return that row. And by that, we now have completed both of our get operation on the table. We have the get all reminder and we have the get reminder by ID. Now, after that, we will move to the post request, and this will be creating a reminder. So create reminder, and this also will have request response as usual. Now, what we want here is that in this request, if you remember in the insert, we don't actually need an ID, but we are expecting to have these value from the user. Remember that we said any question mark in this query represent a value that will be passed by the request itself. So first of all, we need to define these values by having const, and we can have the time, the interval minute, the message, and the active as the requested body. Since we do have some values that will be static, like for example, any created reminder will be an active reminder, so we can simply pass this as a true. And also any reminder, we can give it a static message, which again will represent the notification that will be sent. So we can also now define a string, and we can say like time to drink water, like that. And with that, we can now start doing the insert operation, since this is a create function. But since we now in here, if you remember, we did a validation to ensure that the ID is exist, we also need to perform some validation over these values to ensure that these values are correct values. For example, we need to ensure that the time is a really time format. We need to ensure that the interval minutes is a positive number, not a negative number. So I copied some validation that I'm going to use right here because it consists some regex. So it's better to have it like that. And basically what we are checking right here is that we are checking if the time must be in the time format, and also we are checking that the interval minutes is not a negative number. It must be a positive number by checking the type first to check if that it's a number, and we also checking that this number must be more than a zero, because even zero will break the logic of this function. After that, what we can do, let me just add this. Okay. So now, since we did the validation, we now can continue with our insert operation. So what we can do here is we will define, for example, the result, and we will call the reminder.insert, which is the function that we created. Let me just really quick, an insert with a capital I, so an insert dot run. And this run operation, this will be performed in any request or in any operation that we will be performing here, that actually either delete, insert, or update a record in the database. And since this is considered to be a tricky or a crucial function, it is safe to wrap this with a try-catch block to ensure that nothing bad happened to this request. And if there was any error, we are able to catch it and we are able to return a proper message to the user. So first of all, let me continue this line by passing the time, interval minutes, message, and the is active. Now, before we continue with the insert function, again, we will create our try-catch block. This will be within the block. And we now can catch the error and return a 500 stats code, which represent an internal server error in these cases. Now, since we did this, we now can create our new record to the database. So we will define this as a new reminder. And since we use the .run function, we are now able to pass the value of the ID that we will be using by using a function, which is the last insert row ID. Because as you remember in here, the ID for each table must be an integer primary key and must be auto-incremental. So it must be a unique value. Now, how can we do that? We will say that this new reminder will have the ID, and this ID will be the result dot the last insert row ID. This will represent the ID, and the other field will represent the other requested data for the request. And if this request is successful, we return a 2 or 1 stats code with the new added reminder. So this will wrap the create reminder, which is our post request in this situation. And after that, now we can start with another function, which will be the update function. Now, this also will be similar to the update, to the post request, which is the create reminder, sorry. We will also have similar body because we want to know what are the values that we are going to add or modify. And also we need to check if the ID is exist, because if you remember right here, the update, unlike the insert did not need the ID. We pass the ID. We don't need to check the existing of a value. We only need to pass these values without needing to check the ID, because the ID will be added by the last row ID function. But for the update, we need to have, or we need to ensure that the ID is exist before we even start the operation. So again, since we did the check ID as above, we will repeat the same operation by calling or by defining this same ID to check first if to get the ID that was passed from the user, and then we will call the same function, which is the reminder get by ID.get, and this will be in a new variable. Let's call this existing reminder, and this will get the get by ID from the user. And as we did here, if this ID is not exist, we will return a 404 with the reminder not found. Now with this, we now set what are we expect to be edited or to be modified in this function. So again, we will also, similar to the post request, we will define these values, but unlike the post request, we don't need to set a default value, for example, for the active or the message, because any new value that will be passed from here, it will be the new value for that record in our database. And again, we need to have the same validation method right here, since we are dealing with the same input. So I will also copy and paste this to check that the time is in the time format and the interval minutes is a number. Also, it should be a positive number. And again, since we mentioned that also in the post request, since we are dealing with the .run function, we need to wrap this with a try catch block. So I'm gonna just autocomplete this and explain it to you just to save you time. So again, we will call the update function, which is from here. And this update function is actually calling the run. We pass the values that we are expected to have in here, which are which are these values in the update function. And again, we will return the updated reminder if everything went well, and we will return the 500 code if there was something wrong. Now, there is something that I think we need to maybe add to this update function, because we already added this chorus function, which is, again, takes two parameters, and if the new parameter is null or undefined, then we don't even pass it, or we don't even overwrite it to the next one, and we keep the existing value. So what we can do here is another layer of validation, is we can do the following. We can check if this value is a null value or not by adding an else safety operator to check that this value is not null before we even update the existing value. So we will do that for the active. We also need to check that this is not undefined, since since this is an integer value, and if not, then the active, like that, will be either 0 or 1. And finally, we have the ID, right? We have the ID, which we don't need to check because it's already been checked in here, and we already ensure that the ID is an integer, and also it is existing in the database. Now, the final function we have is the deletion function. So this will be a delete reminder function. And this also will be similar. We will check for the existing ID before we delete the record, and then we will perform the delete operation. So this also will have the ID, parse integer request params, and we will call the existing, and we will check if this existing is exist or not. And for the deletion, we don't really need to pass anything, because the delete is only delete a reminder, a record from the reminder table if the ID is exist. So we already checked for that. Now we only need to have a try catch block. We call the delete function with the .run ID, and then we return the successful deletion, or we return a failed message if this operation failed. But I only need to add one thing to this code, is I want to make the stats code for the deletion to be 204 for the success, not 200. And with that, we have now completed all the operation, all the functions that we need in our reminder controller. We now can get all reminders, get by ID, create a reminder, which is a post request, update a reminder, which is a put request, and delete a reminder, which is a delete request. And all of that we did it by performing validation on everything to ensure that we don't have incorrect input to be passed in the params or in the request itself. Now, finally, since we completed all of that, we only need to export all of these function from this controller so we can use it in both the index file and the routes file. Now we will proceed with the intake controller. I created a file called the intake controller in the controllers directory, and this controller will manage the user water intake logs and also calculates the daily progress summaries. So we will start by importing our both DB and intake, and these will be imported from our DB file. And then we will start with our first function, which will be adding an intake or logging an intake to our database. So this will basically be an insert operation or a post request. We will start by define this as log intake, and this of course will have a request response, and in here we will pass what we are going to add to this operation, which is the insert operation. Now if we get back here to the DB, we can notice that the insert function right here expect to have 3 values, which is the amount, basically the amount of water the user will take, the timestamp, and the date. Now timestamp and date are not actually provided by the user. This must be auto-fill and also auto-calculated from the function itself, and I will show you how can we do that in just a second. So first of all, if we start with the request body, again we will pass the amount and also we will pass the timestamp. And for the timestamp, we want to make this as a new date, which is a new instant of the date, and we call this to ISO string, and basically this will log the current time where this request has been created, and this will create this right here. The instant of date will create a date time format for our timestamp. So it will basically has the date and also the time as an hour, minutes, and seconds. And with that, we can use it to extract the date, which will be only the year, month, and day. So we can define the date right here. And what we will do is we will take the timestamp and we want to split the t, the first index of the t. So this will take the first index of the datetime object, and this will be the year and the month and the day. Now, since we input the amount, we need to check that this amount, we need to set a validation checking that this amount, first it should be a number, and this number must be larger or greater than 0. So we can do that by having an if request, and in this if request we will check the type of amount, and we want to check that this is a number. So if it's not a number, and also if this number is not larger than 0, then we can return a 400 status code error message like this. This is an invalid amount, as the Copilot now suggested for the message, or it could be more specific, like you need the amount to be in milliliters and also a positive number. So we will keep that as it is right here. Let me just close this to avoid any errors in the IDE. And now, since we do have the date, we do have the request body, what we need to do, same as we did in our reminder controllers, we now call the insert function, but before that we need to call the .run with the insert in order to get access to the last insert row ID, which will be the unique ID of this record inside the intake logs. And again, since we are using the .run, we need to wrap it with a try catch block. So we will have try and catch error. For the error, we will return the standard 500 internal server error, and within our try block, what we will be going to do is we will define the info, and the info will have the intake dot insert, and remember this insert comes from here since we already defined it in our statements, and from here we will call the dot run method, and we will pass our request body, which by now, since we extracted the date from the timestamp, we already have the amount, timestamp, and date, and we also did the validation over the amount. So this will be our request body, and now since we are in the try block, if there is no issues, we can simply call the status code 201 for the post request, and this will be the .json, and in here what we are going to do is we will set the ID into the info.last insert row ID, amount, and timestamp and date. And by that, we now have completed the log intake, the first function in this controller. Now for the second function, we will now get the summary, and it will be the today's intake summary for the user. So what we are going to do is we will have this function, so we will call it the get today intake, and of course this will have a request, a response, and like so. So we will start with the today, and or let's call it the day, and as you can see, the autopilot is already suggesting using this this method to get the date of the day. But if you remember, we already created this date helper and we created this date today method, which do the exact same thing. So instead of repeating ourselves, what we are going to do is we simply going to import that from here. So we will say the date today, and this will be imported from the helpers and the date helper. So now we can easily call this function right here, which is the date today, and this will be the first value that we are going to need in the response in order to return a valid date time in the response that is actually readable to the user instead of the long date time object. Then we will define the rows, and this will be the intake.get by date function, which we already defined it in the DB file right here, the get by date, and this will have the where condition over the date itself, and it will be a descending order by the timestamp. So here we will have the all, and this will be over the today, since the function or the operation expect to have at the date in the where. So on that date we will be validating the values before we return it. Then what we are going to do is we will have this total, and the total will have the rows dot reduce, and by reduce we will simply do a simple math operation. And as you can see right here, for the reduce, this is an array callback that is used to get the summary plus the row. So basically it's similar to the summation function that we are using to get all the logged in amount for today using this method, which is the dot array. So this will basically take the sum and the row, and we'll add everything to the sum itself and return it in this value, which is the total. And finally, when this exists and we have our total, we can simply return the JSON that will the JSON that will have the date as today, and also it will have the total, for example ml, short for milliliters, as the total, and also it will return the entries as a row. And this is basically the response. Of course, feel free to return a static message with these values as a dynamic values within the string message if you want, but to keep everything simple, we will return it all in this JSON without any other messages. Now let's create our get all intakes function. This will be very simple and straightforward. It will be the get all intake, and also it will have a request response and this will basically call the get all method that we statement that we already defined in our DB file, and it will be something like this. We will define the rows, and this will be the intake get all, and we will return the JSON method, as simple as that. Let me just fix that really quick just to make everything organized. And this will basically return all the intakes. If we back to our database, we can say that in the get all we don't use the where keyword, we only return everything, but we also return everything ordered by a timestamp descending order. So what if we want to add some optional filter here? And this optional filter will be if the user provided a date within this request, then in this case we will have to call this function, which is called by date, but we need to pass that date. So this will be helpful to return the intake or a specific date, let's say. So how can we do that on this function exactly? What we can do is we can simply define a new object, which will be the date, and this date will be taken from the query of the request itself. Then in the rows, before we return everything, we will check if this date is null or not. So basically, if the date has a value, that means that we need to return the intakes based on the date that was passed in the query. So what we can do is we will call the intake, but we will use the get by date, and we will pass that date into the function. And with this, we basically recalling this method right here, and we will return that based on the past date that we use. But if there was no date provided, meaning that this is null or empty, then we basically return the get all, which we originally did. So this is let's say an optional filter for the date. You can use it, you can return the get all, but I think that it's useful to add it in here. Now the final function that we will have is the delete intake function, and this will basically call the delete from the database, from the table. We will delete a record, and since we are deleting a record, we of course need the ID, so we will define the ID, and we will use the same method that we already used in the reminder controller by call the built-in parse integer to ensure that parse integer on the request params on the ID itself. And I'm so sorry, but yeah, params.id. Copilot is very useful, but sometimes it really confuse you when you want to write code. So yeah, so now we use this parse integer just to ensure that the passed value is an integer, and if it was passed like this, for example, which is 1 as a string, it will convert it into this, which is a normal one, which is a string. Now, if you remember in the reminder controller, whenever we do the ID, we usually call the existing, or we define an existing object and just check if this ID is exist or not, and we return the 404 not found method. There is another way, and we can try it in this function. Since this is basically only one line of code, we will basically call the intake.delete.run, and we will pass that ID. What we can do is the following. First of all, since we are using the .run, again, we need to wrap everything with a try catch block. For the catch, we will return the usual 500 internal server error. Now, what we can do right here is we will define the result or the info, whatever you want to call. We will call the intake delete dot run, and we will pass, of course, the ID. Now, until now, we didn't do any validation on the ID, but what we can do next is the following. We can add an if condition checking on the result itself. Did this result change in the record, meaning that was this execution and the dot run execution run successfully or not? Because if there was no ID, and it means that this operation failed and returned a 0, then that means that this ID is not exist, because it does not accept another property, because we already checked that this is an integer. So this cannot be an undefined or a mismatch, typo, or even incorrect format type. So if this wasn't run, then basically we couldn't find the ID, and in this condition we can now return the error message of 404 that the intake was not found. And of course, if the operation runs successfully with no errors, we can return the successful message. But again, I prefer always for the response to make the status code 204 for the deletion, just to make sure this status code is not straightforward 200, because again, if we don't pass it, it will by default take it 200. So again, just to recap, what we did is we need to have an ID in the intake, because when we call this SQL query, we need to check the ID, and this is exactly what we did. We passed the ID, we get the ID from the params of the requested body, and then we did this. We run the delete statement. We executed by the dot run function, and we passed, of course, the ID. And as we mentioned here, this line basically indicates that if there was no change, meaning that this dot run failed, this means that this ID was not exist. Therefore, we will return this message of intake log was not found. And now finally, what we can do is we can basically export everything, export all the functions that we did in the controller. And by that, we finished all the controller code for the intakes, and we are now ready to start with the routes. So now let's start with our routes. So in here, we will create our first file, which will be the reminder routes.js. And in here, we're basically going to give the path for each function that we created from the reminder controller. So of course, we need to import Express, since it's the framework that we are using for our APIs. And in here, we want to define our router, and we can say that express.router for this function. Let me just remove this real quick. Then we're actually going to import all of these functions, which are the get all reminders, get by ID, create, update, and delete from the controller itself. Now we start with the router for each one. So the first one, router dot get. The first one will be just the path with no ID, because the first function is get all reminders. So this is basically going to be for the get all reminders. The second one it is the get by ID, and since it's getting by ID and we are getting the ID from the params, then we need to pass that ID in here in the path itself, and then we call the function. The third one will be a post request, since this is a create reminder, and this also will not have any ID within the request itself. Because it's only a post request. And for the update and delete, we also need to specify the ID that we are going to either update or delete from our database. So we only, of course, need to set the correct function method. And for update, we use the put. For delete, we use the delete method. And after we finish that, we simply export our router. Now, since this is complete, we now only need to create the intake router. So this will be the intake routes.js, and similar to the previous router, we of course start with the import of the express. So express requires express. We also define our router like that. But in here, we don't actually get from reminder. Again, a Copilot sometimes does some messy code. So in here, we have the log intake, we have the get today intake, we have the get all, we have the deletion, the delete intake, and these are all coming from the controller, the deletion controller. And same as we did previously for the log intake, we create an intake, so we need to post this. For the get today, we are passing a date, so we will pass here a date or a today, since it's the param that we will use. For the delete, we need an ID, and for the get all, we don't need anything. We can, if you remember in the date, we set this as optional parameter that we can use, so we can also pass the date in here. But since we define this as a query, then this will be written as a query in the request itself. It will not be passed as a params. If we set this to params, for example, then we need to define it in the path itself. So if we back in here, again, we will start with the router.post for the intake, the get today, and we pass the date, the get all, and the delete, which requires an ID. And finally, we do the export for everything. So we export the router, and now we are ready to start work to import everything to our index file. So we will go to our index. We already defined everything basically needs in any Node application. We specified the port, we set up the middleware. We also handle how to close the database safely. So what we need now is under the middleware, we will start by using these routers and give the name of the path for the reminder and the intake. So we will now start mounting routers by calling the use, and we have the reminders, and this will be for the reminder router, and we will have the app.use intake for the intake router. And finally, since we have called this, now we have the full application ready. We can of course set this as the basic path when the app runs, which is just a welcoming message. And I think now, I think this is incorrect, because we don't need to do that. We must define the router up here instead of that. So just let me fix this real quick. We call this the reminder router. Exactly, and this will be the intake router, and we will replace both of these with the reminder routes. Sorry, and this must be deleted, and this as well will be the intake routes. And now let's just run the app, and once we run it, if everything went well, you will notice a new file here, which will be the name of our database. And you remember we called the water reminder.db. And this means that all these queries run successfully and everything is ready to start testing. Let me save this. It's not saved. So now I will just call node index.js. So we have an SQL error here. We do have this. Okay, so where is that? We have it in the execution SQL file. Okay, so this is here. Okay, and this is here. Where is the error? So you have an SQL near this. Okay, so where is this? Not really sure what's the issue. I know. Okay, so the issue is here because, at the end of the last value in the SQL, we don't need to have a comma. So I think this is the issue. Now, if we run it, Yeah, it's running well, and we have here the water reminder.db is already created, and everything now looks well. So now I can actually run some quick test. I have this tool which called the client Thunder, the Thunder client, sorry. So in here I will just use the local host, which is this one, as our base URL, and I will call, for example, if we back to our let's say, okay, so let me test this. I will call the create reminder request, which is this one, create reminder. And by the way, I ran into an issue. I imported this as a reminder, not a reminders. That was some typo, and I ran the test before I recorded, and I noticed this issue. So I just fixed this because we exported this as a reminders with an S, and in here we imported as a reminder without S. So this was a typo issue. So please, if you code along, try to fix it from your end, because of course it will raise an error. Now, just to launch up to perform a quick test, sorry, I'm going to call the create reminder function, and this will basically has the reminders as the path for it, since we already defined this. Since we already defined this in the index as the reminders, and now we can select the method, which will be a post request, and we will pass the body. If we back to our reminder controller, then we have in the create reminder, we have 4 values to pass, which will be time, and the validation for the time is it must be in this format, which is the hour minute format, and this is basically what this regex do right here. And for the interval minutes, it must be a number, and it should be greater than 0. As for the message and active, we already set default values for them, but we're also going to pass them in the parameter and the request, sorry. So in here, I will write a JSON for the body. So we will have the time, and this will be, for example, like that, as a format of hour and minutes. We have the interval minutes, and this should be a number. So we can, for example, pass 10. And also we have the message, and we will pass the same default message, which is time to drink water, for example. And for the active, we will, sorry, this should be like that. It's a key value pair. So this should be, for example, true. Now, if I send the request, as you can see right here, I get this this response. Now, what happened if I don't pass these two values? Will this also work? If I send this, you can see that it was created before, because the previous one was ID1, this is an ID2, and these values already been used because we used a default value for them. And just to make sure that this is working, if now I make this like that, you have now a 3 ID, the ID3, meaning there is now 3 reminders, and this has a different values right here. Now, since we have values in our reminder table, we can switch this into a get request, and in the get we don't pass anything in the body, so we can keep the values here or we can delete it. But in both cases, if I do the send request, I will get an object with or an array with all the current reminders that we have. And if I use, for example, the ID, and I want the ID of 4, let's say, I will get that this reminder is not found. But if I pass 2, for example, I will get the value of 2. Now, if I want to delete a reminder, and I will select the delete method, and let's select, for example, 6, and I will get also reminder not found. You can notice that the stats code here is 404. And if I select 2, I should get stats code with 204 because this is what we set in our code. The final thing that we want to test is the put method. And let me just back here real quick. So in the put, we also check the values of the time interval message. Okay, so in the put message, in the put request, sorry, I will edit the third one. First of all, let me just get all of them. By all, let's check what current reminders do we have. Okay, so we have 2. We have this one and this one. Let me modify this one, the first one. So I will make this as a put request and pass the ID of the first one. And in the body, I must pass what values do I need to change. Now, of course, the ID will remain the same. So I want to change, let's say, only the time. I don't want to change this value. So I can basically pass the time as the new value, and I will set this to 0999, 0900, which is, instead of 8, we will make it 9. Now, if I send this request, you can see that this was edited successfully with 200 stats code. And this is why actually we use this calls method in our query, which is Yeah, this is the one. And basically, again, what this takes is two arguments or two parameters, which is the old value and the new passed value. So if the new passed value was null, then we keep the old value. And this is exactly what happened. This interval minutes, we kept the old value, which is 10. And since we didn't pass anything in the request of put, we keep the 10 without any changing. And this, and we can see this in the response right here. This remains as a 10, and we only pass the only value that we need to edit. But of course, we need to have the ID in the request to ensure that we are targeting the correct record. So the final thing I will do is to have a get request over them all. And you can see now that the edited one in the database, there is a default created and modified at or edited at in the database. So since this was edited, this became, let's say, the first one, and this will become the second one in the order of the database. So now let's test the intake logs. And we basically have three main functions. We have the create intake. So I will add this right here and change this to a post request. Let's back to the intake controller. And in here, the log intake, we do have to pass three values, which are the amount, timestamp, and date. As we already stated here in this statement of insert, it expects three values. Now, if we get back to the controller, we already defined the timestamp as the current instance of the date. And we also calculate the date in the function itself by splitting the timestamp and taking only the year, month, and day without the time. So what we actually need to do is only to pass the amount in this request. So I'm going to change this into an amount and send the request, and I will get in here an invalid amount, which makes total sense because we set a validation right here that the amount must be a number and it also should be greater than 0. So I will change this from removing the two quotation and make this as a normal integer, a normal positive number, sorry. And I will set this to 10, for example. Now, if I send the request, it will create it successfully. Now, if you are wondering why the ID is 9, is because I performed some multiple tests and before I start recording, so there is already an existing data in the intake table. So this is a new record added to the table itself. Now let's get all our intakes. Let's just turn this into a get request and call that. And as you can see, we have all of these data. Now, if you are also wondering where is the 3, 2, and 1 IDs, is because I tested the delete functionality. And since our ID is auto-incremental, if we, for example, deleted the 4th ID right here, and we created a new one with the post request, it will not take the ID of 4, although this ID now is empty, but since it's auto-incremental, it will increment on the last ID that was created, which is, for example, the 9 9 ID, sorry. So the next record will have the ID of 10 and so on. Okay, so in the get request, you remember that we have two get requests. We have the get today and we have the get all. And currently we did get the value of the get all because we didn't pass any date in the query. If we pass a date in the query, we will call the get by date function, which will get all the functions within that date, because in here we already set the total, and we said that the total is a summation of all the rows that have this condition, and the condition here is get by date. So if I back in here, if I want to pass a date, and let's back to the function again. Remember, the date here is not a request body, so it will not be passed like this. I will not define a date and write it here. The date in here is a query. So how can I pass a query to the path of the request? For example, in this tool, the Thunder client, there is already in the controller itself, there is already this query where I can write the query parameter and state the value. But if I want to pass it directly to the URL, all I have to do is just have this question mark, type the name of the query, and as you can see, it is auto-typed in here, then have this equal sign, and we'll pass the value, and the value expected is a date format. So for example, I will take this one. Now, if I run this, it should return only the values in the intakes that has this date. And if I change this date, for example, into 8, it will only return the values with an 8. So basically, this get request, if it has a query parameter, it will return it based on that query parameter. But if it does not have any date in the query params, then it will return everything. If I delete this, it will now return everything. Now, the final thing we will be doing is a delete request, and in here I simply pass the ID of the record that I want to delete. So for example, 6, and you can see here we have this 204, 204 status code, meaning that it was deleted. If I change this to get and send the request again, you can see that the record with the ID 6 has been permanently deleted from the table. And by that, I believe we have completed all the test scenarios over all the functions that we have built. This tutorial was meant to be a tutorial that help you understand how to use SQLite in Node.js. And I didn't want to build something maybe very common or very basic like a to-do list app or something like that. So I choose this project, which is a water reminder. I believe this API, although this is only considered to be maybe an MVP application, it has only the minimum requirement for this scope of this project. I'm sure that there are a lot of features and a lot of maybe filters and a lot of advanced methods and advanced conditions that we can provide to make this project maybe better and better. But again, the main idea of the tutorial was to provide something that can help you maybe understand how you can work with SQL language and how can you implement and use SQLite in Node.js framework. And with that, our project has been completed. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in another tutorials in the future. Thank you.